Thank you, Lance. Thanks a lot for having me today. It's great to be invited along to speak. As Lance mentioned, I manage the Victorian Wetland Program, which is within the Waterway Health team in the Department of Environment. Energy, Environment and Climate Change. It's fairly new. So today I'll whiz through a little bit about the convention. I think it's largely been covered. Cover off on what the Victorian policy is for listing new sites or changing the boundary of existing sites, and a bit about the process for listing. And then I've got a slide about our sort of broader wetland program. So this is, we've covered this territory today. Ramsar's a framework for international cooperation for the protection of wetlands. As others have mentioned, it started off as being about water birds. This is the East Asian Australasian flyway on the right here. So the idea of Ramsar, at least initially, was that we protect habitat right throughout the flyways. And of course we have these, this is the one that we're involved with, but they occur right around the world. So the idea was to try and, in a cooperative way, have habitat for these migratory waders, or water birds, so that they could be supported. So, of course, when the Australian government signed up to the convention, they signed up to wise and sustainable use of all wetlands, and that point's been made today. And also the listing of internationally significant sites. There's 9 criteria, which happily Dylan has covered off on, so I don't need to go into that. We have our 9 criteria for listing. There's some things about species at a site that can contribute to the site getting listing, but just a few notes on that. The species have to be nationally or internationally recognised, so it has to be listed under the EPBC Act or IUCN Red List. They've got to be wetland dependent, and we keep a list of wetland dependent threatened species. The site also has to regularly support those species, and that's generally 2 out of 3 years. There has to be significant numbers at the site. As we've also already covered, we manage Ramsar sites to maintain or improve their ecological character. And the ecological character is the things that make it internationally significant, and then the things that support that criteria to survive in that environment. Ecological character is benchmarked at time of listing. It's the Australian government that's signatory to the convention, not the Victorian government. So it's the Australian government that is the big decision maker. But the Victorian government manages our 12 Ramsar sites in partnership with the site managers. Most of our Ramsar estate is Parks Victoria land, and also Melbourne Water. They have Edithvale Seaford and the Western Treatment Plant. And then so it's the Federal Environment Minister that's responsible for signing off on listing new sites and also for changing Ramsar site boundaries. So just a little bit about the documentation requirements. So there's this initial step that gets taken, which is that we do an assessment against our Victorian policy. Our Victorian policy, if the requirements are met for that policy, then it's also met the requirements of the Commonwealth. And our first step is to get that in principle support from the Minister that we think this is a good idea. And then the formal documentations, Ramsar information sheet, which is a requirement of the convention. And then we have the ecological character description, management plan and boundary description. And these things, the listing of the site, describing ecological character and the boundary description have nationally agreed guidelines. So these are the things that we have to meet, and we are thinking about changing them, but these are still in place. It needs to be nationally agreed, so the Commonwealth and all the jurisdictions, if we're going to make changes to that. So current state of play is we need the ecological character description, management plan and boundary description. That's the Australian requirements. So we don't have guidelines for developing management plans, but what we have is these Australian Ramsar management principles, and these are listed under the EPBC Act regulations. And the management plan under these, it stipulates the things that a management plan has to include. And as Max pointed out, there's a lot of stuff in there about consulting stakeholders, people that have an interest or may be affected by your management of the site, and providing an opportunity for input while you're developing these documents, but then also for sort of ongoing input into the management of the site. The management plan, the Australian Ramsar management principles also stipulate that the management plan has to describe the ecological character and the actions that we're going to do to control the threats to ecological character. I've put some notes down there at the bottom which have probably really been covered off, so I'll just skip over that. So Ramsar sites in Victoria are protected by a couple of bits of legislation. One of them state, which is the Environmental Effects Act, and federally under the EPBC Act. So these acts specify that no activities can occur that will significantly impact the ecological character of the Ramsar site. But Ramsar status doesn't preclude any specific activity from occurring. It's really about, it needs to be shown that it's not going to have this impact on the ecological character. And that goes for things that people might propose for something inside a Ramsar site, but also in the catchment of that Ramsar site. So in a sense, it doesn't really matter if it's just inside or just outside, it's treated the same. It can have an impact on the Ramsar site.
Excuse me, Andrea, just a quick question. Is that like the whole of the site or just part of the site? So if it would impact just part of the Ramsar site, is that considered, or does it have to have an adverse impact on the whole?
No, it's really, so the ecological character is the components, processes and services, and they have limits of acceptable change. So it needs to be that we think it's likely to have an impact on any of those things. So, but we do take the whole site together, but yeah, it is, you know, it looks specifically at the limits of acceptable change around those critical components, processes and services. So it doesn't matter if it's geographically only a part of the site, it has a look at, you know, what, you know, the whole site's ecological character. Okay, so the EPBC Act, it doesn't stop things that were already established and lawful uses, but anything new that's proposed for the site has to go through the full process. So this is our, you know, so we have this Victorian Waterway Management Strategy, and it has a policy in there specifically about listing new sites or changing the boundary of existing sites. And I'm not going to go through all that text, but I can just give you a bit of a summary. It has to meet Ramsar criteria, that makes sense. It should be consistent with Ramsar strategic directions, and this also makes sense. I mean, what we try to do is, you know, it's kind of good conservation management. It's trying to make sure that what we're looking after is a set of sites that are comprehensive, adequate and representative. So we have these directions from the Ramsar Convention or Ramsar Secretariat. Land managers have to agree, and they also have to come up with actions that would deal with the threats to the, you know, what it is that they want to list the site for. It must provide, improve the level of protection. It must, we've got to look at all the alternative management options, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a sec, why that's important. Listing has to improve the management of the threats. There has to be feasible and cost-effective management options available to maintain the ecological character, and of course this is really important in the context of climate change. If something is, you know, if projections for the next 10 years would mean that, you know, for sea level rise that a site's about to be overwhelmed with, you know, marine water, then that would be a reason we would look at, there would be other ways that we could manage that site. Ramsar listing isn't the right tool in all situations. It doesn't mean that we wouldn't try and manage the site, but the Ramsar Convention as it is expects us to be able to maintain the site at time of listing. It has to contribute to awareness raising for site and wetland conservation. It has to have community support, and this is the big one. This is why we have to look at, does it improve the level of protection? What are all of the management options? Does it improve treatment of the threats? Because the administration and documentation for Ramsar is resource intensive, time consuming, and it can go over a fairly long period of time. So it takes a certain amount of funds to get a Ramsar site up. Would you be better off spending that money on actually managing your site? So just a little bit about how we work in Victoria as far as waterway management goes. So I'm in the Waterway Health team. We oversee this Victorian Waterway Management Framework. We develop the state strategy. CMAs develop the regional waterway strategies, and within those are the priorities. They develop the priority waterways for investment. And the people that help us to implement this policy, it's not our department regions that do that, it's the CMAs, Melbourne Water, Parks Victoria and traditional owners. There are other funding sources away from this Victorian Waterway Management Framework, including money from Commonwealth initiatives, but that's provided to preferred suppliers, and that so far has been catchment management authorities. So this is just a bit of a flow diagram to capture what needs to occur for something to get listed. It's got to meet criteria. Can't really read that. The land manager has to agree. It has to be public land, and the reason why we do that is because the way that our investment framework has been set up, we have to apply for funds and then CMAs have to apply to us for funds. We've got a fantastic track record of being able to spend those funds, for the stated objectives. There's really, there's a well-established governance. So we're a good bet for state funds. But if it's not public land, then we have issues around not having the track record of delivering the investment and getting achieving the objectives, and then, issues around stewardship as well, because, it has to be in perpetuity. Does it have community support? And if the answer is yes to all of these things, then we look at the feasible and cost-effective management options. If it doesn't have those, like I was saying before, Ramsar isn't the best tool for all sites. So we would look at other ways of managing that doesn't involve Ramsar listing if there isn't these feasible, cost-effective options to maintain ecological character. Then we look at, what are the current management arrangements? Are they adequate to manage the site? Is the site doing okay? And if that's the case, we'll keep spending our money on managing the site rather than listing it. But if we really think that Ramsar listing is going to improve things, then we finally get down to this one, which is consider it for Ramsar listing. It's my last Ramsar slide. So this is just kind of, these aren't all the steps, but they're the main ones. So as I said, we look at, we do an initial analysis. We get our Victorian Water Minister to give in-principle support. We do a detailed assessment against criteria. And then we get an agreement to proceed, and that would be the Victorian Environment Minister again, but also us at officer level working with our colleagues in the Commonwealth. So everybody has to agree, this is feasible and a good idea. As I think all of the speakers so far have pointed out, Ramsar is red hot on stakeholder and community involvement. So we get the community and main stakeholder, or all the stakeholders involved, and they help us to develop the documentation. Once the documentation has been developed, then we get Oh, thank you. I've had a head cold. It's a bit croaky. So then there's agency consultation, and that's, making sure that all the departments in Victoria are on board, talking with our federal colleagues. And then finally, we seek approval from the federal government. And if it gets approved, then the Ramsar Secretariat's notified and they list it. So that, just to get an idea of, what's involved and why it takes so long. So this is my final slide, just a bit about, what we do in the wetland program. So the Victorian government's responsible for implementing the Ramsar Convention in Victoria, and that's us, the wetland team within Waterway Health. So that's management and monitoring of Ramsar sites and wise and sustainable use of all wetlands. What we've got currently, we're preparing to update our statewide strategy, and once that's to a certain stage, then the CMAs will start developing their, updating their regional waterway strategies. So one of the issues that we have in the wetland space is a lack of sort of foundational data. So over the last 5 or 6 years, we've been developing these sort of statewide information about values and threats, and the threats include things like hydrological stress, and we're doing that by detecting inundation using Landsat data. Another big threat for wetlands in Victoria is land use change. So it's a really big step forward for us to have statewide information on these things. The value data is things like waterway-dependent threatened species. So we have models. We've modelled the habitat across the state, so we've got an idea of what occurs where and where the sites are that are supporting a lot of biodiversity or the most important habitat for individual species. And all of this, of course, can be used for prioritisation. So not just looking at where our high-value assets are, but the ones that are most threatened. And another big part of what we do is monitoring. So we want to know how effective our management is. We monitor wetland extent and water regime, and again, that's the Landsat imagery. We've been working on that for about 8 years, I think, to get a really good system up and running for that. And that's actually been used, we've provided that to the Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability, and it will be in the next State of Environment report, which comes out sometime this year. Also wetland condition, and we are currently undertaking a major update of the wetland inventory. So that's polygons for where wetland habitat occurs across the state, but also we have attached to each one of those all of the attributes of the wetlands, and that had been really patchy. There'd been a lot of data gaps in that. And it's been a real issue for us. So this next major update, which is occurring currently, should see a big improvement in that area. And that's it.
Thank you. Willing to take any questions?
Yeah.
We've got time for a couple of questions. So we've also got, in terms of questions, our discussion speakers sort of forum at the end, which you'll get an opportunity to ask extra questions. So if you've got your questions, you don't get them answered right now, write them down and ask them later. But yeah, a couple of questions on the floor. Yes, Jennifer.
I'm interested in your prioritisation criteria. What do you prioritise the wetlands for? And maybe I have quite a loud voice. So, in particular, I'm interested in whether you prioritise them in terms of their function across the landscapes. I'm working with the Victorian Environmental Water Holder, so I'll disclose who I am. And we're very interested in the purpose and the use of wetlands across the landscape. For example, are they breeding sites, or are they where the juveniles go to grow up, or what is their function?
Yeah, yep.
Because for the water that we have, we've got like a legacy system really, which is sort of, you know, you have this bit of water, you have that bit of water, and then everyone who's got a wetland wants the bits of water that we've got. But really, we need to be more strategic, and I'd be interested to know whether the department's doing any thinking along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely. So, where to start? The last time we developed the regional waterway strategies, we didn't have good coverage of data on wetland dependent values and threats. This time, at least, we have all of that information. So the prioritisation is, to answer that question first, is about wetland condition. So the objective is to improve or protect the best, improve wetland condition. We have over 38,000 individual polygons in our wetland inventory. So another piece of work we're doing currently is to work closely with CMAs and Melbourne Water to develop groups of wetlands. So more sensible management units on which we can base our, you know, characterising values and threats and doing the prioritisation. So that's a big part of the puzzle. We have some work on connectivity, and that's a few years old now, but it couldn't get at the hydrological connectivity because we've done, you know, it's a complicated landscape, but we've also done a lot of things to interrupt water flow, and that's quite hard to measure. But yeah, absolutely. So, and the habitat distribution models will be used. So in the past, you know, we've just said, well, this wetland supports an endangered species, all right? And that gets the same sort of importance as something that supports 3 vulnerable species or something like that. But we want to move on from that and look at using more conservation management principles, like so that we know that for each of those units, whatever they are, wetlands or wetland groups, how much are they contributing to the conservation of wetland-dependent species? And that will help us with a ranking. So, yeah, we can talk more, but that's the thinking we've got behind our current work.
Thank you. Any other questions? No? Well, sorry, Max.
No, I got an interest in the one about private land. It's actually the next talk, I think. So why don't you, why have you chosen not to use the listings on, potential listings on private land?
Well,
there are legal ways of managing that. Other states have done it, for example.
Yeah, and we, you know, we do have strong relationships with our interstate colleagues. I do know the sites that have some that might be entirely private or at least have significant bits of private land in them. It's not that we would never go there, it's just that we have much stronger and, you know, tested frameworks. So it's we constantly have to, I guess, balance up the risk. So we have to put in a bid for money. We have to, convince the funder that, we're going to use this public money wisely. So it's a question about, how could we see that going forward and what would we need to put in place? So if it's public land or if it's in the Parks and Reserve systems, Parks Victoria is the manager and have very clear responsibilities, and that's in perpetuity. So it would be a different approach for us.
I asked a number of reasons. One is I think there's missed opportunities. I agree it needs work, but one of Dylan's last points was about the convention, and Australia's agreed to look at this, looking at other mechanisms off reserve mechanisms for conservation. So we've got this initiative that people are recognising and trying to work through this. It's a big initiative, and yet we've still got this stalling process at the state level.
Well, I don't think it's a stalling process. So this is whether something gets listed as a Ramsar site. So our objective is wise and sustainable use of all wetlands. We do have incentive programs for wetlands on private land. Some of those are permanently protected under Trust for Nature covenants or Section 69 agreements. It's a very well thought out program, that wetland tender program. It's been funded by the Commonwealth in the past. We're hoping for it to be funded again through the Commonwealth. We care just as much about the biodiversity on private land as on public land, but our Ramsar sites tend to be the big, important wetland systems in the state, and they happen to be managed by parks.
Okay, thank you. Dylan.
We've got some sites like Bannerock where that's gone really well, but there are some sites in the basin where there's parcels that are owned by private landholders where there's been some difficulties and tensions. I don't think we want to rule out having sites on private land, but we can't just go ahead and list them because there's a couple of places where clearing has occurred, say, on someone's land. So I don't know, I think the next step is to build a pretty solid system for how to manage that going forwards, but I don't think that exists. So, yeah, there's definitely Commonwealth support for private land conservation.
Thanks, Lance.
Yeah, thanks very much. We'll move that discussion to our... Andrea, thank you very much. Here's your crown and bag. Thank you. Thanks very much.